Happy Sunday, everyone. Do you recall last fall when the COVID stuff was going crazy, especially in California? They had started to mandate, I think, in K through 12 classrooms, having to require masks and I think then even vaccines for all kids. And there were a lot of Latter-day Saints in California who were really upset and did not like the mandates that were being put on them. So there was a lot of chatter across the country, certainly, frankly, probably even the world, but certainly among some Latter-day Saints in California about whether they could or would be able to get an exemption from the COVID vaccine. And many states in the past, not California anymore, I don't think, at least I'd have to double check, but many states have allowed for religious exemptions to other vaccines for your kids being able to go to public school. Some states, like in Utah, allow for both a religious exemption as well as a personal exemption, so it doesn't just have to be religious. I believe California removed the personal exemption, but still allowed for the religious exemption. So then there were a lot of Latter-day Saints who were talking in California months ago, trying to determine if they could get some sort of religious exemption for the COVID vaccine mandate so that their kids could continue to attend the school without having to get vaccinated or whatever. And what was interesting about this is that there was so much interest apparently in the issue that the area presidency over California, so this is the church, the regional church leadership, the area presidency came out and issued a letter, which I found to be rather surprising, given that this wasn't really happening in other parts of the country as well. And so this made the news first, I think, in the Salt Lake Tribune, a couple other places as well. And that's how I found out about it, because I didn't get this letter read over the pulpit here in Utah or anything. I would not have known about it. So here's what this letter says. Keep in mind this was published in September to local clergy, the bishops and stake presidents and so forth, directing them on this issue of, can you get a religious exemption from a vaccine mandate like for the COVID vaccine? It says that no church official can sign any kind of document supporting the notion that church doctrine or teaching is opposed to vaccination, or that the church is opposed to vaccination mandates. So this was sent to all the bishops and stake presidents, as I said. So then it says, as to the former, which is this idea about church doctrine being opposed to vaccination. So as to that issue, the opposite is true. The church not only supports, but also encourages vaccination, the letter reads. And then it says, as to the latter, which is this issue of the church's opposition to vaccine mandates. So as to that issue, the letter says, the brethren have not taken a position. And so then it says, in some instances, signing such documents could even be perjury. And then the letter concedes that our faith has an important doctrine about agency, but that alone, the letter says, does not provide a religious basis for disobeying the law or demanding special exemptions from it. And so then it says that anyone who asserts the belief that a belief in agency allows for a valid religious exemption to a vaccine mandate, so people who make that claim, who believe that our doctrine of agency and choice and so forth is a basis for a religious exemption to a government mandate, the letter says that that has never been supported by the church. So this was in September. And it's interesting, right? Because here's this issue where, yes, the church has been supportive of vaccination, generally speaking. And then certainly in COVID-19, you had President Nelson call it a literal godsend. You had church leaders posting on their Facebook pages photos of them getting jabbed and everything. You had PR statements and all these things saying, that the COVID vaccines were, helpful and that members were urged in getting them. And so this letter is not wrong in that basis, that the church has been supportive of vaccination generally, and certainly specifically when it comes to COVID. But this is interesting, this broader question, not just of the vaccine or vaccinations generally, but of vaccine mandates. And for the area presidency over this area, I don't know that it's just California. The area may include other states. I'm not sure. I do know that the area presidency over Utah is just for Utah because there's so many members. But I imagine maybe this is like a Western states area presidency. So for them to say that the church has never taken a position on government mandates and religious exemptions, and that it's wrong to believe that our faith allows for any kind of religious objection to government mandates, forcing people to do what they don't want, et cetera, et cetera. Like that to me is an interesting question. Where do they get off saying that? I agree, right? There's no verse that says, the government may not mandate vaccines. Like if they're looking for something that detailed, we're not going to find it. But the broader doctrines of our faith, I think, absolutely have bearing on this issue. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, because this question of religious exemptions, though raised when it comes to COVID vaccines more recently, is a broader question that has been factored into many other issues. Before I share a couple of those other issues, of course, on the COVID vaccine specifically, there's many other examples. I think of, in fact, someone shared this to me. It didn't really get a lot of attention, but President Oaks, Dallin H. Oaks, who's a former Supreme Court justice here in Utah, and then an apostle, and now he's in the first presidency, he spoke at the University of Virginia at a forum there in November. And this question of vaccines came up. And so I've seen the YouTube clip where what I'm about to read comes from. And unfortunately, I couldn't find the broader transcript or video, but there was a clip here where he says what I'm about to read that I think has bearing on this issue of religious exemptions and government mandates. So keep in mind, this is November, so just 4 months ago from the time that I'm doing this today. In November, President Oaks said, and I quote, "I just think it's silly for anybody to think that any available, reliable medical evidence, untainted by political considerations, would give you a reason to seek a religious exemption." So he said it's silly to seek or to want to seek a religious exemption from a vaccine, from the COVID vaccine specifically, which they were being asked about. But he did have an interesting qualifier in there, right? Untainted by political considerations. He's saying that for you to want a religious exemption from available, reliable medical evidence, untainted by political considerations. So I had a lot of people send me this video and they're like, "Oh, President Oaks is saying that it's silly to want a religious exemption, and how ridiculous is that?" And I don't think the spirit of what these people were telling me is necessarily wrong, but I do think that they weren't allowing for that qualifier, right? Untainted by political considerations. Because, of course, we don't need a religious exemption from a vaccine or from aspirin or from taking Percocet or taking vitamin C. A religious exemption is only relevant when there's a mandate, when there's something that you want to be exempt from. So in that sense, President Oaks's quote is a bit odd, because religious exemptions are completely irrelevant unless there are, quote unquote, political considerations that have tainted medical issues, right? So he's saying, I think it's silly to want a religious exemption from, medical evidence, and he's basically saying a vaccine, untainted by political considerations. Well, of course that's silly, because there would be no need for a religious exemption from just the free, open decision of what medication or vaccine or whatever is okay, because then there's no mandate. Therefore, there's no need for a religious exemption. So really the issue, and maybe he was being a bit disingenuous in how he was describing it, perhaps, I don't know, is that religious exemptions are at issue precisely because this medical process has been horribly tainted by political considerations. Just yesterday, again, at the time I'm recording this, the director of the CDC publicly admitted that their recommendations were based in part upon watching CNN. She literally said they were watching CNN's feed and they had hope that the vaccine would work, and then they shaped some of their recommendations that then everyone weaponized, and we know what happened. The friggin' CDC is following the CNN and then hoping that the vaccines would work and therefore making public claims. So the whole thing has been tainted with political considerations. If it was just open and anyone can decide for themselves what they wanted to do, this wouldn't be an issue. It would be let live and let live. It would be teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. But that's not at all what's at issue here. What's at issue is precisely the compulsion that is being used, the weaponization of the political process, tainting the medical process with political considerations, to use President Oakes's quote. So then to say that it's silly, I think is a bit, again, perhaps disingenuous. I don't know what the right word is, because everything is tainted by political considerations. And that is the context for this issue. So for him to suggest otherwise, I think is a bit odd, especially because 3 months prior, President Oakes signed a letter along with the other members of the first presidency urging all of us to get the vaccine, claiming that it's safe and effective, when I think it's really neither. And then saying, and I have it right here, that we can win this war if everyone will follow the wise and thoughtful recommendations of who? Medical experts and government leaders. The very statement that they issued urging all of us to get vaccinated and all these things was tainting the issue with political consideration. It wasn't, hey, go talk to your doctor, and if it's right for you, depending on your level of risk, then we urge you to consider getting vaccinated. That's not what they said. The statement that President Oakes himself signed just 3 months prior to saying that it was silly to think about religious exemptions urged people to taint the medical process with listening to government leaders who are notoriously corrupt and who are watching CNN to take their cues of what they should compel everyone else to do. The whole thing is tainted with political considerations. Okay, so I mentioned there's other issues, right? Because we can talk about COVID all day long, but this question of religious exemptions versus government mandates goes beyond the past couple of years. It goes beyond, medical issues. It goes, certainly beyond COVID. Another one that I was thinking of was being a conscientious objector in the military. And what does that mean, right? Because here we have a government mandate. Well, it could be a draft. It could be when we're coerced into military service, as has happened in the past and as exists in other countries. Or it could even be just someone who joins the military today and is, sent off to fight in a war that they come to believe is immoral or unjust. So are we allowed, is it possible to seek a religious exemption from fighting in a war? Well, there is a legal process by which individuals can claim the status of conscientious objector. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1971 focused on a portion of the law that says, no person shall be subject to service in the armed forces of the United States who, by religious training and beliefs, is conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form. So there's kind of three prongs to this that I think when it comes to seeking a religious exemption to fighting in a war. The first is that it has to be by religious training. In other words, kind of your church doctrine or church teachings. Then it has to be religious belief, so you have to personally believe these things. And finally, you can't just oppose a particular war. You can't say, I don't want to go fight in, Ukraine in World War III, or I don't want to go to Libya or Afghanistan, or serve in Guantanamo Bay and torture people, or you can't object to one particular thing that you think is immoral. The government requires you to obtain this in order to obtain this religious exemption, they require you to object to participation in war in any form. Now, there are some people in our faith who take that position, and I applaud them. It's a very kind of anti-Nephi-Lehiite, pacifist approach. They feel that they're best exemplifying what God has required about loving your enemies, that you can't love people that you're fighting against, etc. I think there is a lot of merit to those arguments. And so those people probably could claim, if they were in the military, that they oppose war in any form. However, I don't think our religious teachings allow us to, or religious training, as it says in the federal law, I don't think that in our faith we can claim that we have religious training. Now, you can split hairs and say, well, the scriptures themselves do say this. And I know that there have been some members of our faith who have successfully obtained status of being conscientious objector and assigned to, medical service or a non-combatant role as a result of prevailing in persuading the military that they are indeed a conscientious objector. There have been a tiny, tiny handful of Latter-day Saints who have gone down this path. World War I, II, Vietnam, and since. Is very rare, of course, because our church culture, as Spencer W. Kimball said, is quite the opposite. We are, in fact, a warlike people, that even members of our church trust the arm of flesh far more than we trust God. And we have a culture in our church of being pro-military, in part because leaders of our church have themselves served. They've been part of this culture. President Hinckley, I wrote this down, he said, those in the armed services are under an obligation to their respective governments to execute the will of the sovereign. When they joined the military, they entered into a contract by which they are presently bound and to which they have dutifully responded. Of course, this was right as they were launching the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, and said that in General Conference. Well, I think of the stormtroopers, right? Here are people who have been bred into this cultural attitude of war and the empire. And then in the newer movies, we've got Finn, I think is his name, right? And we all applaud him for waking up, for thinking independently, for deprogramming himself. And you could argue, well, he had a contract. He had to execute the will of the sovereign. He entered into a contract by which he was presently bound. Right? Do we not, if we cheer Finn, why would we deprive Christian soldiers of doing the same? To say that they must oppose all wars rather than just a particular war because someone maybe believes that there is just war in some cases and true self-defense, they would not be allowed to be a conscious objector and object to immoral wars unless they object to all wars. It's this interesting question of, what does our religion actually say when it comes to war, and what are the religious exemptions that we can seek? And more importantly, I think, would we find in our church culture a community that supports these ideas? There was an interesting article in the Dialogue Journal that I came across in preparing for this, written by Orlando DeLogu in 1971. I'm going to read a little bit of this because it strikes me as very relevant to this question. Of being a conscientious objector, how our church treats this question of obtaining religious exemptions from military service, whether compulsory, as in the case of a draft, or contractual, in the modern current case where people are just signing up. So he says, one is led to ask, in a church of millions which has experienced the persecutions of the past, which knows firsthand the evils of war, which holds forth all of the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants as scripture, not just those portions that advocate support for constituted government, and which claims modern revelation. Why so few perceive the moral rightness of the positions, and then urged in this volume, which are being a conscientious objector? Why, he says, why isn't the substance of this volume, being conscientious objectors, right? Why isn't the substance of this found in the proceedings of a recent general conference? Why isn't it the subject of a recent issue of the Ensign or the New Era? Why aren't those within the church who are conscientious objectors accorded a full measure of the love of their brethren and the outspoken approval of the general authorities for so courageous an action? Surely these, and not those who march off to war, are among the meek who will inherit the earth. One may even ask, why is there an official church silence with respect to participation in this war? Again, this is 1971, which today is so unnecessary, so terrible in its conduct and character, whose enormities and excesses are so great as to be incalculable in terms of human misery. Why is there silence? Silence has been interpreted by church member and non-member alike as approval of the national policy and position. It has led to harassment and disapproval of those comparatively few church members who seek conscientious objector status. More important, at a time when our own young people, indeed when a broad cross-section of the youth of the entire nation, cry out for moral leadership, an end to war, and addressing of national energies to long unmet domestic needs, we seemingly favor and support a militaristic national policy which constitutes both to prepare for and to wage war. Where is our moral leadership. So those who in our faith want to be a conscientious objector, want to seek a religious exemption, have to show that there is religious training for that, that there is personal religious belief, but then they have to go against the grain of our entire church culture, which is very idolatrous in terms of being pro-war. We talked about that last week. I'm not going to dwell too much more on the war topic, but the point is that here you have government mandates, whether you have a draft, which has happened in the past and may happen in the future, or you have the government holding a soldier accountable for what they agreed to go be a stormtrooper in the empire's wars. You have, in a sense, in both cases, a government mandate. And what are the criteria and opportunities for people to seek a religious exemption from them? And why does it have to be religious? I'm going to touch a little bit more on this in a minute, but I think it's problematic when we limit our objection to the state to religious issues, when we so narrow our concerns to fixate on this question of religious freedom and religious exemptions. I think we end up missing the forest and even abandoning the forest for a single tree, right? When indeed the rest of the forest is being burned down, and that's going to come and get our little tree as well. We can't fixate just on religious freedom if we truly care about freedom. It's a bigger issue, and I'll touch on that more in just a minute. Okay, so another one that I wanted to mention is, I found this interesting. I found this from a decade ago. This is the Deseret News, almost exactly 10 years ago. They were commenting on this law that passed in Washington state, compelling pharmacies to carry Plan B, which is the abortion medication. And there were some pharmacists who objected to that, who did not want to be compelled to do something that they felt violated their religious beliefs. And so they filed a lawsuit, and they won. And here's the Deseret News in an editorial. So this is the official position of the paper. And I'm going to read one brief quote. "The society that genuinely cherishes freedom of conscience should expect and accommodate more rather than less conscientious objection." I think that's a great line. Because so often, and this article itself notes that when we talk about conscientious objectors, it's typically in the context of war and opposing war, but they were saying it's an appropriate term anytime conscience conflicts with the performance of societal mandates and duties. So then again, I'll read, "The society that genuinely cherishes freedom of conscience should expect and accommodate more rather than less conscientious objection." And of course, those who conscientiously object, especially in war, are treated as treasonous, supporting the enemy, not doing their duty, wimps, everything else. You get presidential campaigns and everyone's like, "Oh, wait, you dodged the draft. You didn't serve. Oh, you didn't go to war, but you did. Okay, hey, you're cool. We support you." Right? It becomes, especially in war, problematic for people who conscientiously object because they're criticized in that way. But of course, we have issues like this with abortion medication. We have the Colorado, wedding cake guy who's been in court a number of times over that because he didn't want to be compelled to render his artistic services on behalf of gay marriage that he found to be religiously problematic. You have the church itself pushing for policies that forge a so-called compromise between the LGBT rights or perceived rights and religious freedom. And it becomes this question of accommodation because you're accommodating people who are trying to diminish your rights, and you're doing so based on a religious argument. So maybe here's where I'll expound on what I was saying earlier. So I found it very problematic in Utah when the church was driving this compromise to basically make sure that landlords and employers could not discriminate against an individual based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And one of the reasons why I found it so problematic what happened, and still do, because now the church is pushing this on a national stage, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff I could share there that I won't in terms of, I think, a problematic way in which they're pushing this. But one of the big problems is that they are looking to exempt themselves. So if you go read that Utah law, it compels everyone else to abide by this law, but then they exempt themselves, right? Oh, we're not going to do this at BYU. We're not going to do this at the churches. We're going to carve out our little, religious freedom over here, and then the rest of you have to abide by this. We don't care about people who object to this on a free association basis or a property rights basis or a freedom of conscience basis, or people who are religious, but you just have a business of your own, and yeah, you have a religious, issue, but because you're not, doing this as part of a religion, because it's not a church institution or whatever, we're going to force you to have to abide by that. I think that's a cop-out. I think it's kind of selfish in a way. And I think it's problematic in the long run when we're trying to make sure to protect people's rights. If we narrow the scope of our interest to religious freedom, we are not focused on what the actual issue is. The actual issue is property rights. A business owner or a landlord should be able to permit whoever they want to associate with on their property and not be forced by the government to associate with people they don't want to. Now, you may find it problematic if a landlord says, we don't rent to Jews or gay people or black people or trans or Mormons or whatever, and as might I, but it is their right. And we should let the market deal with that. We should let people be punished through protest or shunning or boycott or negative Yelp reviews or whatever. It is not the role of the government, because when we concede that the government should force some people to act in a certain way, but then say, hey, as long as we can get a religious exemption over here for the church, we're screwing everyone else. And ultimately, the church is going to be screwed, because the culture shifts out here where everyone else is having to comply with different things. And then those people who got an inch are now looking for a yard, and they're pushing further. And pretty soon it's gay marriage and in the temples and all these things that a lot of people are concerned about. But it's because we've already conceded defeat on the broader principled argument. We've let the forest burn down as long as we protect our tree, but it's starting to heat up and the flames are starting to scorch the tree. And pretty soon I think the tree burns down too. So I think it's strategically problematic for the church to take the approach it does when it comes to religious freedom versus LGBT rights and anti-discrimination, and to focus on religious exemptions from government mandates. So here's the church seeking a religious exemption of its own, not for religious people, not for people who hold these values in whatever capacity they do in life, only for the institution itself. So religious exemptions, in my mind, are kind of pointless if it's about an institutional exemption and not people who have religious viewpoints, like the cake maker in Colorado, right? He should have every right to say, these are my religious values. I wish to live in accordance with them to their fullest expression. I don't compartmentalize my views over here, and then when I open my business, I can completely sidestep my views. That it is my life. It's all in one whole. And I should be able to choose which clients I want and not support projects that I find to clash with my values. But if we concede that there's room to compromise in that and have religious exemptions for the church versus everyone else, I just think it's really problematic. Another thing to bring up when it comes to religious exemptions, and I think this is key, is a lot of this stems from Mormon polygamists, a lot of this problem, I think. So George Reynolds in 1875, so the federal government, remember, as the Republican Party had their official platform attacked the twin things of barbarism or something. It was slavery and polygamy. And the federal government started passing all these laws against polygamy. Utah was a territory. They were clashing. You remember that history, at least generally speaking. Well, George Reynolds offered himself up as a test case to provoke a court challenge to these new federal laws that were banning polygamy. And so he, having been married to one person, he went and got married to another person intentionally to provoke that law. He was assessed a fine of $500 as well as 2 years of hard labor in prison just for marrying another person. He, challenged it in court, lost, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the black-robed lawyers, in all of their infinite wisdom, came out with the ruling in 1879, Reynolds versus United States, in which they asked this: can a man excuse his practices to the contrary of the law because of his religious belief? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and in effect, permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. government could only exist in name under such circumstances. This court ruling became the pretext for many things that followed in narrowing what the state will allow when it comes to so-called religious freedom. Because the Supreme Court in the Reynolds case drew a dividing line between religious belief and religious behavior. Do you understand the difference, right? They're saying, believe whatever you want. That is protected by the First Amendment. But behavior that is an outgrowth of those beliefs, we can regulate however we want. And they went on in the Reynolds case to say, oh, would we really say it's okay for infanticide and, sacrifice and killing people and everything just because someone... Total red herring. I mean, total logical fallacy, because no one is claiming that it's okay to kill people, right? That wasn't even an issue. Of course, if you're harming someone else, even if you claim a religious basis for doing so, right, that would be an appropriate thing to say. Your religious belief that, people named Connor should, die does not allow you to go kill people named Connor. But that's not what this issue was, because the issue was about consensual polygamous behavior. So for the court in the Reynolds case to say, oh, well, we wouldn't want religious infanticide, therefore we can't have religious polygamy, is completely specious, because there is not the harm that there is in some of these other cases. Now, granted, the people who wrote this ruling and at the time were attacking polygamy believed that consent basically didn't exist, that people were being brainwashed, that they were being victimized, that polygamy was inherently harmful. And so perhaps in the justices' minds, they were being consistent with that belief and thinking that there is no consent in the context of polygamy. But the point is that they drew a dividing line that future courts built upon this wall between religious belief on the one hand and religious behavior on the other. And so despite people feeling like, well, in my religion, right, I don't want to, affiliate at all with anything having to do with gay marriage or with war or with, vaccines that have aborted fetal cell tissues in them, or abortion, or all these things, right? The jurisprudence of the court, in large part because of polygamous Mormons back in the late 1800s, have been very firm in opening the door to government regulation of behavior. That no, you can believe whatever you want. Belief is up to you. But once you step into the public and you have a business, or you're working for someone, or living somewhere, or once you're doing anything, the government can regulate it all day long. There's this quote I love from Henry David Thoreau. Of course, his story is interesting, right? Why did he write Civil Disobedience? It's because he was in jail and observing kind of the social situation around that whole incident. Why was he in jail? Because he refused to pay a tax for the American-Mexican War at the time. And so there are many reasons why what he did and taught and wrote about is very relevant. But I just want to share this brief quote. He says, "Must the citizen ever for a moment or in the least degree resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right." So he's basically saying that what's important is what's right, not what is lawful. And if we have a conscience, we should be able to act consistently with that conscience. We should not be required, in order to obtain a religious exemption, to have to point to an institutional teaching, because sometimes the church, culturally or even doctrinally perhaps, or the interpretation of that doctrine might be saying, no, wars are great and go fight battles and do whatever Caesar tells you to do and be loyal and you signed a contract, right? The church as an institution might be taking a different position. But if I, as an individual, have a religious belief, I should be able to act consistent with that belief. But also, importantly, if I'm not a religious person, right? If I have an ethical belief or a moral belief that, I derive from some kind of ethical framework outside of a religious one, however I derive my belief system and my code of ethics from, I should be able to act consistent with that. And if we say like, nope, you're not allowed to do that because your church leader said otherwise, or your religious institution does not do that, or you're acting in the public square or whatever, I think that's very problematic. People should be able to act as they want, consistent with their conscience. Just like we cheer the stormtrooper who, broke away and decided to do his own thing. We should allow that same option for the rest of us as well. Ultimately, I think the problem is not the religious issue. It's the mandates themselves. Again, to President Oakes's point, right, about this being silly, no one would really have an issue if there was a vaccine and people could choose to take it and they could decide for themselves and evaluate the risk and look at the pros and cons and look at how safe and effective it actually is after several months of being used by other guinea pigs, right? No one would have any problem if there was a climate in which people could just make their own decisions free from mandates and, how did he say it? Political considerations, the tainting of political considerations. It wouldn't be silly at all. There would be no question of religious exemptions, or there would be no controversy. But there is controversy precisely because the government is mandating things. So while I think our religious beliefs do give us an opening and should give us an opening to push back against some of these mandates, and while I believe that our church doctrine, unlike what some people believe in the area presidency over California, saying that our church leaders and our doctrine don't have anything to say about vaccine mandates, right? I think that's wrong. But it's beyond vaccines, and it's beyond this issue. It's about mandates generally. It's about coercing other people. It's about proper authority. And I think if we narrow our scope myopically to look at just the COVID-19 vaccine, or just at religious freedom in the LGBT context, right? Or just at what church teachings have said about war and what we've been taught and what the cultural interpretation is, I think we are being too myopic. I think we're fighting a losing battle. I mean, we have these great doctrines and these bold beliefs, and it's like we tie our arms behind our back and we cut off our legs. It's like that soldier in Monty Python, right? He's getting all his appendages lopped off, and it's only a flesh wound, right? And pretty soon he's a stump and he can't do anything. I mean, talk about not being able to act, but instead be acted upon, as it says in 2 Nephi. Right? We're being acted upon, I think, because we're playing a game that others are manipulating, and we don't realize that there's chess happening, and we think it's checkers, and we're like, oh, religious freedom, let's go here, and then let's talk about this, and let's look at what the area presidency has to say about, vaccines. When while important, I don't want to diminish the importance of these conversations. I think ultimately these are bigger forces at play, and if we diminish our focus to religious freedom, as important as that is, or religious exemptions, as important as they are, we should be talking about anyone's right to object to government mandates. People being able to make their own choice about whatever it is, whether it's who they marry, or where they live, or what they want to inject into their bloodstream, or whether they want to go kill brown people on the other side of the world. Like, let people make their own decisions for whatever reason they are. That, I think, is the important issue. And especially, I don't have it pulled up, so I'm not going to be prepared for it, but Joseph Smith had this great quote where he talks about, for him, he cared about the liberty of everyone, the Muslim and the Protestant, and like, he has this quote where he says, like, I care about everyone's liberty. We shouldn't just care about our own. I wish I would have pulled that up. I only am now thinking about it. But so maybe someone in the comments or myself later on the Facebook Live can chime in and share that. But what I like about this quote is that it is expansive and relevant to everyone. Instead of saying, oh, we only care about religious freedom for the institution itself, and everyone else, you're on your own to go fend for yourselves. Sometimes I feel like the institution looks out for itself, as it should. I'm not knocking that prioritization per se, but we miss an opportunity to boldly stand for our beliefs that should care about everyone, all churches, all individuals, whether they affiliate with a church or not, non-religious people as well. I don't think that our position should be, we're going to take our ball and go home as long as we get to keep our ball, right? Our position should be, government mandates are evil. People should be able to choose. Let's teach correct principles. Let's inform people and give them the freedom to be able to choose. Let's operate in a way consistent with our faith, even if the doctrines about agency don't specifically have any mention of vaccine mandates. We can act in the general spirit of the law about loving our enemies, loving one another, talk about turning the other cheek, talk about supporting one another, following the greatest commandment, all of these things that suggest that we should stand against coercion in any form and simply support people in making choices that they think are most helpful to them. That, I think, is something that we ought to be doing, and not fixating so narrowly and myopically on something where I think we're going to lose in the end. Because again, it's the Pastor Niemöller quote. Do you guys remember that one? Pastor Niemöller. I read when I read Bonhoeffer. I recommended that, I think, on the first or second Sunday musing that I did. Fantastic book by Eric Metaxas. I think that's how you say his name. But it's not the autobiography. It's a biography about Bonhoeffer. And learning in that book about Pastor Niemöller as well was very interesting, because I was very familiar with this saying, but I didn't know much about him himself. I'm going to mention this now, or read it now, and you're going to be familiar with it. This is one of at least his most famous quotations. He says, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." And I think of that saying, or that quote, because I feel like that's maybe where we're, as a church, as a community, a bit deficient. We are willing to fight for religious freedom for the things that we care about, but not other issues. We're not looking at the property rights issues, or the economic issues, or the justice issues, or the, injustices that the government is perpetrating over here, or removing people's rights, or we're not looking at other countries and what's happening to religious freedom there. And there's so many opportunities to, I think, be a light unto the world in a very literal sense, right? To shine a light in dark places, to say, that is wrong, here is what God has said, here's what we stand for. I think those are bold opportunities that may alienate some people and may make some enemies, but I think may also be fantastic for missionary work to attract people to our cause, right? What is that Joseph Smith quote? He says something like, "A religion that does not require sacrifice of all things is not enough to," etc. I can't remember, but the spirit of it was, that ours is a bold faith that does require a lot of us. And I think we should rise to that occasion to demonstrate to the world the application of those principles. We shouldn't be saying, "Oh, Caesar, keep doing all your tyranny over there. I'm not going to talk about it. I'll leave it alone. I won't mention it all, as long as we can kind of stay over here and pray and read our scriptures and, send missionaries out." And instead, if we would stand up and speak out for other people, like Joseph, if we would care about the liberty of the Muslims and the Protestants and the atheists and everyone else, and talk about the violations of their rights that are happening, then I think they might care about our own, like Pastor Niemöller is saying. They might stick up for us. They might be around and still have their rights when someone comes after us. This is what I worry about. I worry about if we're kind of too, not selfish isn't the right term, but if we focus about only what we care about and don't really speak out that much about what's happening to other people. I've mentioned on past episodes, right? In Russia, before all this started happening with Ukraine, the Jehovah Witnesses that were being, disappeared and taken away from their families, right? Or last week, the statement coming out expressing concern about the armed conflict without mentioning who and what, and being more bold. And again, this even relates to something I mentioned before about institutional obligations versus individual obligations. That it may very well be the most prudent thing for the church not to be boldly calling everyone out and doing these things. And so we have to leave room for that to be the right answer, because that might be what God is saying should happen right now. But that doesn't mean that we as individuals don't have these obligations, that we shouldn't be examples, be our own light unto the world. But we too often wait to take direction from the leaders. We think that we have to model good behavior and that their behavior is what we should do, and that their silence on these issues suggests that we either should be silent or that we're justified in being silent and not caring about it because they're not talking about it publicly. I think these are all big problems and ultimately are leading us down the path of losing our freedoms because we are not out there as a community boldly declaring these doctrines, not selfishly seeking religious exemptions only for the issues that we care about, but standing and saying, here are these religious doctrines that we espouse. Here's what they mean, not just for me and wanting my own exemption over here for this issue, but here's what they mean for everyone. There should be no vaccine mandates at all, right? There should be no draft at all. We should let people bake whatever cakes they want and rent to whoever they want. And that's what freedom of conscience requires. That is, I think, what we should be doing more of. That is what I would love to see us as a church community doing a bit more of, speaking out for other people, so that when we need someone to speak out for us, other people will see that we cared about them too. They'll come to our rescue. They'll speak up on our behalf. Religious freedom is super important. Not just religious belief, but religious behavior, the outgrowth of what we believe. And the Supreme Court in 1879, thanks to George Reynolds, and he was coordinating with Brigham and whoever the church leaders were at the time, but thanks to that incident, we now have court precedent that works against us, that draws a dividing line between religious belief and religious behavior, that allows Caesar, or justifies Caesar, in regulating people's conduct however he wants, as long as we can pray and believe what we want and go worship at church, because, hey, religious belief is fine. But the moment that you act in a way consistent with that faith, but in a way that we don't like, or that our law says that you shouldn't, right? That's when Caesar will put his foot down. And that's when a lot of us in the church will just cower and say, oh, well, as long as I can pray and whatever. Like, our religious belief is more than that. It should be more than that. Here's Stephen L. Richards. He says, our religion is not a thing apart from our life. It is incorporated into it and forms a part of the very tissue and sinews of our being. It provides a rule of conduct and of action for us, not only in our occasional worship, but in our lives, in our work, in our play, in all that we do, in the whole course of our conduct. You can't, in my view, draw a dividing line between belief and behavior, because behavior has to be consistent with belief. And if we believe certain things, then we should act in ways consistent with those beliefs. We should not have a religious bucket and say, as long as we can pray over here, we're okay, and we can go act however we want and follow the law and be loyal to Caesar and execute the will of the sovereign, right? Like, we have to be acting consistent with our faith. And I think a lot of us do very poorly at that. I think we don't really emphasize that in our church community very much. I don't think we talk about what that means. Just this morning, we were in Gospel Doctrine reading about Abraham and all these false gods and all the idolatry. And I spoke up in class just to share my perception that it's hard for us to relate to these Old Testament figures because, and I wrote about this in Christ versus Caesar, that I think so often we think, those silly Israelites, always chasing dumb gods and false idols. And what were you thinking, worshiping a golden calf? And how much of an idiot can you be to, be literally worshiping this golden calf in front of you? And so we don't really relate. We don't really draw much from these stories because we think that they don't apply to us. When in fact, they apply to us perhaps more, as much or more than they did back then, because our idols today are not visible for us to see. It's the arm of the flesh that the Book of Mormon warned us about. Spencer W. Kimball, again, I shared last week that quote about us being a warlike people, that we worship gods of stone and steel, that we want government programs and policies to provide our salvation, that we look to God when rather than looking to God when we are in need, we look to government. And we seek the support of the arm of flesh. The Israelites and all these people were not morons. They were not worshiping these dumb idols just because it was fun or because other people were, right? They credited, the false religions at the time credited these false gods as being the means of obtaining rain for their crops or food or safety on their journey in the wilderness. They credited these other things with their mortal success and safety and well-being. Do we not do that today as well? Do we not credit, government programs and taxpayer subsidies and public education and welfare and the military and all these things with keeping us safe and providing for us and being the reason why we're as prosperous or safe as we are? We are, as if not more so as a society, idolatrous than our Israeli forebears. And I think part of the problem for us is that we don't recognize that. We don't learn from the scriptures in that way. And so then we think about religious freedom in this narrow little context when we don't realize that the issue is far bigger. And that if we want to have religious belief and religious behavior connected in one, then we need to stop being idolatrous as well. We need to not have, as Neil A. Maxwell said, our summer cottage in Babylon, right? Where, oh yeah, I go to church on Sunday and I'm all religious. Then the rest of the week I'm voting for things and supporting things and believing things and advocating for things, totally inconsistent with, what my religious beliefs require of me. I think we need more consistency. I think we need more religious conduct that is consistent with religious belief. And I think we need more advocacy of what behaviors and actions are consistent with our religious beliefs. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, if we don't have people connecting the dots for other people and saying, look, because you believe this, here is how you should act, it leaves the door wide open for a whole host of interpretations if people even attempt to interpret their religious beliefs, but this wide range of things where people are all over the map and feeling like they can be a good Latter-day Saint or a good Christian because they pray or they pay their tithing or they got baptized or they declared their belief or whatever. And then over here, they can just do whatever they want, support whatever candidate they want, advocate for whatever, wars and government policies they want. And no one's calling them out for the inconsistency. No one is out there boldly advocating for what consistency actually looks like, because we've disconnected for 150 years this idea of religious behavior and religious belief. We've allowed our society to compartmentalize, and our church community to compartmentalize religious belief over here without connecting the dots and showing what consistency looks like for religious behavior more broadly. And then we go out and ask for these narrow little religious exemptions from vaccines or from wars or from, having to employ LGBTQ plus SIA 2 plus, whatever the acronym is today, people. And we do so to the detriment ultimately of our liberties because we're caring about our own, but not caring about those of other people. And then there's no one, as Pastor Niemöller said, left to speak up for us. I think what's required of us is caring about other people's rights, whether they are for religious reasons or not. I think we should be outspoken in defense of people who believe differently than us, but who are being mandated to do things that are inconsistent with their belief. We should be advocating for policies and laws and a society in which people are able to act consistent with their conscience and not tyrannized into compartmentalizing religious belief and disconnecting it from the actions that they're required or encouraged to do. So I think we're kind of way off the path when it comes to where we should be in this. And while advocating for religious freedom is important, it's only part of the puzzle. And if we don't acknowledge that there are other pieces to the puzzle, if we don't try and jealously guard the rights of those people as well and focus on freedom more broadly, I think we're going to lose religious freedom as well. It's important to talk about. We should keep trying to defend it, but we should recognize that there are other things worth advocating for and defending as well. And if we don't, I don't think we should be surprised when we find even more encroachments by Caesar on our religious freedom, compressing it to the point of near irrelevance. Because can we really cheer a society that tolerates us praying and going to church when all of our other behaviors consistent with our faith are restrained, criminalized, criticized? I don't think that's a society that we want. And so I think we have work to do if we want to foster that type of mentality that applauds and encourages and protects not just religious freedom, but all freedom. The end. Have a good Sunday.